Number 1. An island smaller than a football field, holding more people packed together than almost anywhere else on the planet. Half a mile off the coast of Colombia, in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, there's a patch of land you could walk across in 90 seconds. It's called Santa Cruz del Islote, and somehow, impossibly, over 500 people live on it. That works out to roughly 1,200 people per acre. For comparison, Manhattan, one of the densest cities on Earth, holds about 100 people per acre. This tiny island beats it by more than 10 times over. There are no cars here because there's no room for roads. There are no farms because there's no room for soil. There's barely room to breathe. And yet generation after generation has chosen to stay, to build, to raise children, and to call this speck of coral home. From above, the island looks almost like an optical illusion, a solid block of rooftops floating on turquoise water, with barely a sliver of visible ground between them. Boats circle it constantly, dropping off supplies, ferrying children to school on nearby islands, bringing tourists who've heard the rumors and want to see for themselves whether they're true. Today, we're counting down the 10 strangest, most remarkable, and most misunderstood truths about the most crowded island on Earth. And by the end, you'll understand why some people believe paradise doesn't need space. It just needs each other. Before we get into it, I want to know something. Drop your country and your local time in the comments below, because I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story is traveling today. Number 2. How 500 people fit onto a piece of land the size of 2 soccer fields. Santa Cruz del Islote sits inside the San Bernardo archipelago, a cluster of small islands off the coast of Cartagena, Colombia. The island itself covers less than 2.5 acres. That's smaller than most shopping mall parking lots. And crammed into that space are roughly 90 to 100 houses, most of them concrete blocks painted in fading blues, yellows, and pinks, stacked so close together that neighbors can pass a plate of food from window to window without ever stepping outside. There are no streets in the traditional sense. Instead, there's a maze of alleyways barely wide enough for 2 people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Walk through the island, and you'll hear 5 different conversations happening within arm's reach of each other. A radio playing vallenato music from one window, a woman frying fish 2 feet away, a group of kids playing dominoes on an upturned crate. Privacy, as most of the world understands it, simply doesn't exist here. Look closer, and you'll notice the sheer density of daily life stacked in layers. On the ground floor, someone might be repairing a fishing net. One flight up, on a rooftop terrace, barely bigger than a card table, someone else is hanging laundry that dries in minutes under the Caribbean sun. A few feet away, through a gap you'd barely notice, a grandmother sits in a plastic chair, watching the entire street below her like it's her own private television. Every square foot of this island has a purpose, and often several purposes stacked on top of each other throughout the day. And yet, somehow, it works. Families have lived on top of each other, quite literally, for nearly a century, and the social fabric hasn't collapsed. If anything, the crowding has forced a kind of closeness most modern cities have engineered out of existence. But how did anyone end up building a village on a rock this small in the first place? The answer goes back nearly 100 years to a group of fishermen looking for somewhere to rest. Number 3. The fishermen who built a village to escape the mosquitoes, not to escape each other. The story of Santa Cruz del Islote begins sometime in the early 1920s, though nobody can pin down the exact year. Fishermen from the mainland and from nearby islands used to work these waters, chasing snapper, grouper, and lobster through the coral reefs of the San Bernardo archipelago. At night, they needed somewhere to sleep that wasn't crawling with mosquitoes, and the mainland jungle was thick with them. Someone noticed a small coral outcropping just offshore, barely poking above the waterline, too small and too rocky to attract insects the way the mangrove coastline did. So they started sleeping there. A few nights turned into a few weeks. A few weeks turned into permanent shelters. Word spread among fishing families that this strange little rock was mosquito-free, breezy, and central to some of the best fishing grounds in the region. More families arrived. They built with whatever they could find: coral rock, driftwood, tin sheeting. Every new arrival meant less space for everyone else, but nobody turned anyone away. That generosity, or perhaps that stubbornness, is exactly why the island grew the way it did. Nobody sat down and planned a village. It simply accumulated, house by house, family by family, until there was nowhere left to build outward, and the only direction left was up. By the 1950s, the island had already taken on the shape locals recognize today, a dense cluster of homes with almost no gaps between them. Older residents recall stories passed down from their grandparents about the early years, when there were maybe 10 or 15 families total, and everyone genuinely knew everyone's business, not out of nosiness, but out of necessity. If someone's roof leaked, the whole island knew before the rain even stopped. If a fishing boat didn't return on schedule, every household noticed within the hour. That instinctive awareness of each other never really went away, even as the population grew from a handful of families into the hundreds who live there today. Number 4. The island where children have never seen a car and don't understand what one is for. Ask a child born and raised on Santa Cruz del Islote what a traffic light is, and you'll likely get a confused stare. There are no vehicles on the island. There's no need for them. You can walk from one end to the other in under 2 minutes. Children grow up never learning to ride a bicycle because there's no straight path longer than a few dozen feet. Instead, their entire universe is footsteps and water. Kids learn to swim before they learn to write. It's common to see toddlers, no older than 3 or 4, jumping off small docks into the surrounding sea, while parents watch from a distance, completely unbothered. Swimming isn't a skill here. It's closer to walking. If you can't swim by the time you're 5, something has gone wrong. Visitors often describe a strange kind of vertigo watching this. A child barely old enough to speak in full sentences will leap off a dock into open water, disappear for a few seconds, and pop back up laughing, completely unfazed, while a tourist nearby audibly gasps. For island parents, this isn't recklessness. It's simply how survival works when your entire world is surrounded by water on every side. Teaching a child to swim here isn't optional, the way it might be considered a nice extracurricular skill elsewhere. It's as fundamental as teaching them to walk or to eat, because the sea is never more than a few steps away, no matter which direction you turn. Education happens in a small schoolhouse near the center of the island, one of the few buildings with any open space around it. Classes are cramped, resources are limited, and many families struggle to afford supplies. But for decades, education on the island stopped around the age of 12 or 13, because there simply wasn't a way to continue further without leaving. That's beginning to change, but slowly, and we'll get to why in a moment. For now, understand this. Growing up on Santa Cruz del Islote means growing up without cars, without much land, and without the modern childhood most of the world would recognize. And somehow, most residents wouldn't trade it for anything. Number 5, there's no fresh water, no soil, and almost no food grown on the island, so how does anyone eat? Here's something that stops most visitors cold when they first learn it. Santa Cruz del Islote produces almost nothing edible. There's no fresh water source on the island itself. No wells, no springs, nothing. For decades, residents relied entirely on rainwater collection, catching what fell during the wet season in barrels and cisterns, rationing it carefully through the dry months when it wouldn't rain for weeks at a time. Food works the same way. There's no soil to grow crops, no land for livestock beyond the occasional chicken squeezed into someone's tiny yard. Every single piece of produce, every grain of rice, every vegetable has to be brought in by boat from the mainland or from nearby islands with more space, like Isla Mukara or Tolu on the coast. Picture the logistics of that for a moment. A single supply boat arrives, loaded with sacks of rice, plantains, onions, cooking oil, sometimes ice, for keeping fish fresh. Word spreads instantly across the island. The moment the boat docks, within minutes, a crowd gathers at the small central pier, families buying just enough for the next few days, because storage space in a home the size of a single room doesn't allow for stockpiling. This happens multiple times a week, an entire island's food supply arriving in waves, distributed almost entirely by word of mouth, an old-fashioned trust between buyer and seller. So what do residents actually eat? Fish, overwhelmingly. The waters around the archipelago are rich with snapper, grouper, octopus, and lobster, and fishing remains the backbone of the island's economy and its diet. Families that have fished these waters for 4 generations know exactly where to find what, at what time of year, in what tide conditions. It's knowledge passed down verbally, father to son, mother to daughter, because there's no textbook for it. There's just experience. And the sea, in recent years, a desalination system and improved supply boats have made life slightly easier. But the fundamentals haven't changed. This is an island that produces almost nothing, yet somehow sustains hundreds of people, day after day, year after year, through sheer logistics and generational knowledge. Number 6. The strange economics of an island with almost no formal jobs. If you're picturing an economy of offices, shops, and paychecks, forget it. Santa Cruz del Islote runs almost entirely on fishing and increasingly tourism. For most of the 20th century, fishing was the only real source of income. Men left before sunrise in small wooden boats, returned by mid-morning, and sold their catch either locally or to buyers who shipped it to Cartagena's restaurants and markets. Women historically managed households in an environment where household management means something entirely different than it does elsewhere. Cooking for extended families in kitchens smaller than a typical closet, managing water rations, keeping small stores that sold snacks, soda, and basic goods brought in from the mainland, tiny shop fronts carved out of front rooms, sometimes no bigger than a phone booth. In the past 2 decades, tourism has quietly reshaped the island's economy. Tour operators from Cartagena began bringing day trippers to see the famous crowded island, and locals adapted fast. Small guest houses appeared. Families began selling handicrafts, cold drinks, fried fish plates, and boat tours around the archipelago. Some residents now earn more from an afternoon of tourist visits than they would from a full week of fishing. You can see the shift most clearly in how children spend their afternoons now. A generation ago, most boys spent their free hours mending nets alongside their fathers, preparing for a life on the water. Today, plenty of them spend those same hours guiding tourists around narrow alleyways, practicing broken but improving English, posing for photos, selling handmade bracelets, or carved wooden trinkets. It's not that fishing has disappeared, it hasn't, but it now shares space with an entirely new kind of work that didn't exist on this island a few decades ago. But this shift brings its own tension, one we'll explore further in a moment. For now, understand that an island with almost no natural resources has built an entire microeconomy out of ingenuity, hospitality, and the simple fact that people around the world are endlessly curious about a 500-person village standing on 2.5 acres of coral. Number 7. The population math that should be impossible, and the housing solution nobody expected. Let's talk numbers, because they matter here. Estimates put the population of Santa Cruz del Islote somewhere between 500 and 1,200 people, depending on the source and the season, crammed onto roughly 2.5 acres. Even at the conservative estimate, that's a population density higher than nearly every major city on the planet, including Mumbai, Manila, and Dhaka, cities famous worldwide for their crowding. So how does housing even function? The answer is verticality, sort of. Unlike a modern city that solves density with skyscrapers, Santa Cruz del Islote solves it with addition. Families build directly onto existing structures, adding a second floor when a son gets married, extending a wall a few feet when a daughter has a baby. The island has grown upward and outward in small, incremental additions for nearly a century, each generation building directly onto the last. Walk through the village and you'll notice something odd. Some walls are clearly 40 or 50 years older than the ones stacked beside them. Different colors of paint, different construction materials, layered like sediment. It's a visible timeline of the island's growth, written in concrete and coral block instead of tree rings. Some families have gotten remarkably creative with the little space they have. It's not unusual to see a bedroom no bigger than a walk-in closet, housing 3 or 4 family members, bunks stacked against the wall, a curtain instead of a door. Rooftops, meanwhile, have become a kind of secondary living space entirely their own, used for everything from drying fish to hosting birthday parties to simply escaping the heat of a crowded room below. On a clear evening, dozens of rooftops across the island fill with people at the same time, turning the entire skyline into an open-air social space that no formal city planner could have ever designed on purpose. There is no zoning board here, no permits, no inspections, just families making room for more families, in a place that mathematically shouldn't have any room left to give. And somehow, it keeps working. Number 8. The health crisis that came from overcrowding, and why doctors are worried. Living this close together isn't without cost. Public health researchers who've studied Santa Cruz del Islote have flagged serious concerns, and they're worth being honest about. With hundreds of people sharing an area smaller than most parking lots, sanitation infrastructure struggles to keep up. Waste disposal is a genuine challenge on an island with no land to bury anything and no space for modern treatment systems. Respiratory illnesses spread quickly in such tight quarters, especially among children. Skin infections, often linked to limited access to clean water for bathing, have historically been common. During disease outbreaks on the mainland, like dengue fever surges that periodically hit the Caribbean coast, the island's density makes containment nearly impossible. If one household gets sick, the entire village is at risk within days, sometimes hours. Researchers who visited the island in past studies documented something striking. In a community this size, illness doesn't stay contained to one family for long, simply because of physical proximity. A cough in one house can be heard through the wall of the next. Shared water barrels, while carefully managed, still create a common point of exposure if contamination occurs. Local health workers, who occasionally visit by boat, have described the challenge in blunt terms. Treating illness here means treating it fast, because there is no room, physically or socially, for an outbreak to stay isolated. There's no hospital on the island. For serious medical emergencies, residents have to be transported by boat to Tolu or Cartagena, a journey that can take anywhere from 40 minutes to over an hour, depending on conditions and the size of the boat available. In a true emergency, that delay can be the difference between life and death, and residents know it. Every family here has a story about someone who almost didn't make it to the mainland in time. Despite these challenges, actual health outcomes on the island have historically remained comparable to, and in some measures better than, similarly poor rural areas in Colombia. Researchers attribute this partly to the tight community structure. Neighbors notice illness quickly. Everyone knows everyone. There's no such thing as suffering alone here, for better or worse, and that social safety net has quietly compensated for the infrastructure the island lacks. Number 9. Why young people are finally leaving, and what that means for the island's future. For most of Santa Cruz del Islote's history, leaving simply wasn't an option most residents considered. This was home, generation after generation, and the idea of moving to Cartagena or Tolu felt as foreign as moving to another country. But that's beginning to shift. Improved boat access, mobile phone connectivity, and expanded educational opportunities on the mainland have opened doors that didn't exist 20 years ago. Young people who finish the island's limited schooling now sometimes continue their education in Tolu or Cartagena, living with relatives during the school week and returning home on weekends. Some never come back permanently, choosing instead to build careers on the mainland, in fishing industries, in tourism companies, in cities where opportunity doesn't require sharing 2.5 acres with 500 neighbors. This slow outflow worries island elders. There's a real fear that within a generation or two, Santa Cruz del Islote could shrink from a living village into something closer to a tourist attraction maintained by older residents, while younger generations scatter across the mainland. Some families have already made that exact choice, keeping a family home on the island for tradition and tourism income, while actually living most of the year in Tolu. It's a quiet kind of tension that plays out in almost every extended family here now. A grandmother who has spent her entire 70 or 80 years on this same patch of coral watches. Her grandchildren video call her from a phone screen, describing apartment buildings, shopping malls, and job interviews she can barely picture. She's proud of them, genuinely. But there's also a quiet grief in watching a way of life that survived a full century, possibly reach its natural end within her own lifetime. Some elders have started documenting island traditions more deliberately, recording old songs, writing down fishing techniques, almost as if preparing an archive for a future where fewer people remain to carry these things forward in person. At the same time, others see this as evolution rather than decline. A young resident named Camilo, who splits his time between fishing on the island and studying in Cartagena, put it simply in an interview a few years back. The island taught him how to survive with almost nothing, and now he's using that same resourcefulness to build a life somewhere with a little more room to breathe. Whether that mindset becomes the norm or the exception will likely determine whether Santa Cruz del Islote still exists as a living community 50 years from now, or whether it becomes a historical curiosity visited but no longer inhabited the way it is today. Number 10. The tourists who arrive expecting a slum and leave completely humbled. It's worth talking honestly about how outsiders react when they first step off the boat here, because the reaction says almost as much about the rest of the world as it does about the island itself. Many visitors arrive with a specific image in their heads, shaped by drone footage and headlines calling this the most crowded island on Earth, expecting something closer to desperation than community. What they find instead tends to catch them completely off guard. Children wave and laugh instead of staring with suspicion. Neighbors call out greetings to each other across the narrow alleyways. Genuine warmth in their voices, not performance for cameras. Visitors often remark that despite having less physical space than almost anyone they've ever met, island residents seem markedly less anxious, less rushed, less isolated than people back in their own spacious homes and quiet suburban streets. One recurring theme in traveler accounts was a strange sense of embarrassment, a feeling that they arrived expecting to pity these families and instead left wondering if their own lives, filled with square footage but empty of genuine daily connection, were the ones actually missing something. Local guides have grown used to this reaction. Some have started addressing it directly during tours, gently correcting the assumption that density automatically equals suffering. They point out working fishing boats returning with the day's catch, children doing homework on a shared porch step, surrounded by cousins and neighbors helping with the answers. Elderly residents never left alone, because there's simply no version of this island where isolation is physically possible. It doesn't erase the real challenges, the the sanitation issues, the lack of healthcare access, the economic fragility, but it complicates the simple narrative that crowding alone defines quality of life. Number 11. What happens to this island during hurricane season and why nobody wants to evacuate? Living on 2.5 acres of coral in the middle of the Caribbean means living directly in the path of hurricane season every single year, and this is perhaps the most dangerous truth about Santa Cruz del Islote that rarely makes it into the postcard version of the story. Between June and November, storms regularly threaten this stretch of coastline, and unlike mainland communities that can retreat further inland, residents here have nowhere further to go. The island itself sits barely above sea level in places, and a direct hit from even a moderate storm could be catastrophic. Government officials have, on more than one occasion, discussed evacuation plans, even permanent relocation proposals, moving residents to safer housing on the mainland. Almost every time, these proposals have been met with fierce resistance from the community itself. This isn't stubbornness for its own sake. For many families, this island represents 4 generations of memory, identity, and survival, and the idea of trading that for a government housing block in Tolu or Cartagena, disconnected from the sea that has fed and defined their families for a century, feels like a different kind of loss entirely, even if it comes with running water and more square footage. So instead, the island has adapted the way it always has, informally and resourcefully. Homes are reinforced with whatever material families can access. Boats are secured or moved to more sheltered waters when storms approach. Extended families consolidate into the sturdiest available structures during the worst weather, packing even more tightly than usual into whichever building has survived the most previous storms intact. It's a fragile system, dependent on advance warning and a considerable amount of luck, and researchers who study climate vulnerability in coastal communities often cite Santa Cruz del Islote as an extreme case study in what happens when a community's cultural identity becomes so tightly wound around a specific, vulnerable piece of land that leaving feels less like safety and more like erasure. Number 12. What this island teaches the rest of the world about happiness, space, and what people actually need to thrive. Here's the part that surprises almost every researcher, journalist, and tourist who spends real time on Santa Cruz del Islote. By nearly every measure of physical space, sanitation, and infrastructure, this island should be a case study in human misery. And yet, visitors consistently report something unexpected. The people here seem happy, not performatively happy for cameras, but genuinely, deeply connected to each other in a way that's increasingly rare in the spacious, spread-out communities most of the world now lives in. Children run freely between houses that technically belong to different families, but functionally belong to everyone. Elders are cared for communally, never isolated the way aging often means isolation in wealthier, more spread-out societies. Meals get shared across walls. Problems get solved by committees of neighbors who've known each other their entire lives, because there's no version of anonymity here. Everyone is known. Everyone is seen. Psychologists studying dense communities like this one point to something called social density versus spatial density. Yes, the physical crowding is extreme, arguably unhealthy by conventional urban planning standards. But the social bonds that develop out of necessity, the constant contact, the shared responsibility, the complete absence of loneliness, may actually offset a huge portion of what we normally assume overcrowding does to mental health. Consider how differently loneliness shows up in wealthier nations, where isolation among the elderly and even among young adults has become something governments now openly discuss as a public health crisis. Entire policy initiatives have been created in countries like the United Kingdom and Japan, specifically to combat what researchers call an epidemic of disconnection. Despite these being among the most spacious, well-resourced societies in human history. Meanwhile, on a 2.5-acre island with no privacy, no personal space, and objectively difficult living conditions, that particular epidemic simply doesn't exist because the physical structure of daily life makes true isolation almost impossible. It raises an uncomfortable question for the rest of us, sitting in houses with backyards, driving to work alone, spending evenings scrolling through phones instead of talking to neighbors we've never actually met. We built all this space for ourselves, and somewhere along the way, many of us ended up lonelier than 500 people crammed onto 2.5 acres of Caribbean coral. That doesn't mean Santa Cruz del Islote is a utopia. It has real problems, real health risks, real economic fragility, and a genuinely uncertain future as younger generations look elsewhere for opportunity. But it also stands as living proof that human beings can build meaning, connection, and even joy in conditions the rest of the world would consider impossible. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Would you trade your space, your privacy, your quiet evenings alone for that kind of closeness? Or is there a version of community we could build back home without needing to live on top of each other to find it? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that a good life isn't measured in square footage. And down in the comments, tell me this: what's the smallest place you've ever lived? And did it bring you closer to the people around you or further apart?